Welcome to this explainer. I'm really glad you're joining me today because we're tackling one of the most fascinating and, frankly, most frustrating disconnects in our modern world. Seriously, have you ever turned on the news, heard these glowing reports about how incredibly well the national economy is doing, and then looked at your own bank account and thought, wait, where is my share of that? Well, today, we're going to visually unpack this massive economic paradox. We're relying on a deep dive into the data from a major Joint Economic Committee report to really understand the growing gap between national wealth, stubborn poverty, and the very real squeeze being put on the middle class. We're going to look strictly at the numbers, map out the realities, and hopefully leave you with a much clearer understanding of what is actually happening right beneath the surface of the headlines. To understand the sheer scale of this disconnect, I want to hook you immediately with this number, 10. According to the data set we're looking at, the gross domestic product of the United States, which is basically the total value of everything produced, has grown for 10 straight quarters. And to add to that incredible momentum, the economy also saw 46 consecutive months of private sector job growth. On a macro level, the engine is humming, the charts are pointing up, the economy is undeniably expanding. Okay, let's dive into this. Hold that massive macro growth in your mind for a second, and now look at this year, 1989. This is where the narrative completely fractures. Because despite those 10 quarters of GDP growth and years of job creation, the data shows that the average American household actually makes less money today, when adjusted for inflation, than it did way back in 1989. We're talking about the era of cassette tapes and neon windbreakers. Think about that for a second. We've had decades of technological revolution, massive productivity gains, and widespread economic expansion, yet the average family has literally lost purchasing power since the late 80s.
So this brings us face to face with the great economic paradox of our time. We have widespread macroeconomic growth, GDP surging, job numbers looking healthy, colliding directly with fundamentally stagnant household incomes. What this data tells us is that the current structure of the economy has essentially broken the conveyor belt that used to deliver national prosperity down to the individual worker. The wealth is being generated, undoubtedly, but it is structurally failing to translate to the bottom line for the average person. Part 1. Stagnant poverty in America. Let's examine the lowest earners in the dataset to understand the foundational floor of the modern economy. The historical data brilliantly illustrates a truly startling reality. During the 1960s, we saw a dramatic drop in poverty in America. It was a period of incredible progress. But starting in the 1970s, that progress completely stalled out. It essentially flatlined, fluctuating slightly but stubbornly refusing to drop. Because of population growth, that stalled rate means a staggering 46.5 million Americans were living in poverty by 2012. The floor of our economy literally hasn't been raised in over 40 years.
And here is a startling data point that challenges a lot of traditional assumptions. You might think that simply getting a job is the guaranteed ticket out of poverty, right? But the data shows that full-time work is not a cure. An incredible 7.3% of all workers aged 18 to 64 still live in poverty. Even if we look just at full-time workers, nearly 3% of them still fall below the poverty threshold. They are clocking in, doing the hours, and still cannot make ends meet. The safety net of simply being employed is no longer enough to guarantee financial survival.
Part 2. The squeezed middle class. Let's move up the economic ladder to diagnose the dual pressures currently suffocating the median American worker.
Now, what's really interesting about the income data is that the pain the middle class has been feeling isn't just stagnation, it's an actual reversal. After peaking right before the turn of the millennium in 1999, real median household income actually dropped by 9%, eventually settling down at $51,017. This effectively wiped out the economic gains the middle class fought for during the massive expansion of the 1990s. The median worker has been sliding backward.
But that $51,000 income figure doesn't exist in a vacuum, does it? We have to contrast those stagnant wages with the cost of actually living a middle-class life. While paychecks flatlined, the per capita costs of healthcare absolutely exploded, jumping to over $8,900. Meanwhile, the cost of a four-year college education, historically the most reliable ladder to a better life, rocketed past $21,000. So you have a fixed or even shrinking pool of income trying to cover wildly skyrocketing foundational costs.
When you put those dual pressures of low wages and high costs into a vice, it physically shrinks the middle class. The share of households earning within 50% of the median income, the very definition of the middle class core, dropped from 48.7% in 1980 down to 41.1% in 2010. The middle is being hollowed out because the math simply no longer works for a growing percentage of families.
Part 3. Inequality and broken ladders. Let's explore where all that wealth is actually concentrating, if it's consistently bypassing the middle class.
Well, around 1980, a massive divergence began. While the average income for most households became a flat, unmoving trajectory, the top 1% of earners pulled entirely away from the pack. They were bringing in an average of $1.26 million by 2012. It's stark. The wealth generated by our economic growth isn't disappearing, it is highly concentrated right at the very top.
Now, inequality alone is only part of the story. We have to talk about the future, which brings us to economic mobility. In academic terms, this is the likelihood that a child raised in one income group will move to a different income group as an adult. It is the specific statistical metric behind what we normally call the American dream. Basically, if you work hard, can you rise?
Let's move to the global stage and see how this builds. When we compare ourselves to other advanced economies, a pretty troubling picture emerges. The United States has uniquely high inequality that is tightly correlated with deeply entrenched earnings immobility. In short, the gap between the rich and the poor is wider here, and it is fundamentally harder to cross that gap than it is in places like Canada, Denmark, or Australia. To really reinforce this broken ladder concept, take a look at this staggering statistic. 43% of people born into the bottom income quintile, that's the lowest 20% of earners, will stay exactly where they started as adults. The sticky floor effect is incredibly strong. When almost half of the children born at the bottom cannot climb out regardless of the macroeconomic growth happening above them, we have to recognize that the mechanics of mobility are struggling. Part 4, a state-by-state divide. Let's shift our focus to geography, noting how your economic destiny heavily depends on your zip code.
Your economic destiny heavily depends on where you live within the United States. The extremes here are incredibly revealing. A household in Maryland earns double the median income of one in Mississippi. But it goes beyond just income. Your chances of climbing the economic ladder in North Dakota are over 4 times higher than they are if you live down in Georgia. It's a powerful reminder that this grand economic paradox is experienced very differently depending on the state you call home.
Part 5. Proposed policy solutions. Let's look at the specific, data-driven suggestions outlined in the committee's source document.
So the crucial point is how we actually address this. The congressional report objectively outlines several actionable levers. These proposed treatments for our systemic economic symptoms include ensuring a fair minimum wage, investing heavily in workforce job training, making college affordable again, solidifying the social safety net for vulnerable families, guaranteeing equal pay to close the gender gap, and ensuring fair tax treatment across all income brackets. These are the tools the report suggests could reconnect macro growth to individual prosperity.
To give you a sense of the scale of impact these policies could have, let's highlight one of the most specific, quantifiable projections from the report. The data projects that a targeted minimum wage increase to $10.10 per hour could single-handedly lift 4.6 million Americans right out of poverty. It's a striking example of how a specific policy mechanism is intended to directly impact that stagnant floor we discussed earlier.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. I want to leave you with a final provocative question that I think perfectly summarizes the core paradox we've explored today. If our macroeconomy continues growing, but individual mobility keeps stalling out, what exactly is the future of the American dream? I highly encourage you to reflect on that and to explore the underlying data for yourself to see what you find. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.